Hi there. My name is Carrie Gravlee. I'm a grad student at Talbot School of Theology, and I am here to tell you about holy anointing oil. So last time we talked a bit about how the oil was used in the priestly ordination ceremony, and this week we're going to backpedal a bit and talk about the steps for making it and how this even could have happened, given that we're talking about people who live in the middle of a desert. So remember that Yahweh had given Moses a series of instructions about how to establish the tabernacle. And lucky for Moses, one of the things he was given was an actual recipe for this holy anointing oil. So we're going to start with that. That's in Exodus 30. And the text says, "Take also for yourself the finest of spices, of liquid myrrh, 500 shekels, and of fragrant cinnamon, half as much, 250, and of fragrant cane, 250, and of cassia, 500. These are all in shekels. And then according to the shekel of the sanctuary, and of olive oil, a hin." So the bigger number, the 500 shekels, was about 6 kilograms, and the smaller number, the 250 shekels, was about 3. So a hin of olive oil would have been about 3.5 liters. So if you've recently ordered pizza and gotten a couple 2 liters, that gives you a general sense of what this would make. But keeping in mind, it is proportionate. So you can do, X number of this, and then it'll be half of that for the other one. I imagine it could be made according to need. So the thing about this olive oil, though, is that obviously because it was scented, fragrant, and holy, it was not to be used for any other purpose. So Aaron couldn't take it home as leftovers for any other, bathing or some other purpose. They did have lots of reasons to use plain olive oil. It was a staple in the ancient Near East, specifically in Canaan. The olive trees would not have been in Egypt, nor would they have been in Sinai, where the Israelites are. But as we know from later biblical studies that you've probably all heard of how big the olive oil was there, and the olive tree was obviously harvested for that. They actually didn't eat the olives by themselves. There's no mention of that in the Bible, at least in the Old Testament. They would have taken this olive oil, which probably would have been relatively easy to obtain. But if you're like me, you're thinking, well, how in the world would a group of just released slaves, presumably not that wealthy, have access to this stuff? Luckily, we know from earlier in Exodus that Yahweh kind of finessed it so that the Egyptians gave the Israelites some parting gifts, supplies and goods for, and who can say, household goods, but it's reasonable that olive oil could have been in that inventory, or if not, Sinai was also a really strong area for trading. There were some key things there, copper mines and turquoise, that drew people to the region for mining those things. And then a trade kind of grew up around it. And so what you'd have is, trade routes back and forth. And then slowly over time, these other things such as the exotic spices, cassia and cinnamon and myrrh and fragrant cane, though they come from places like Arabia, the coast of Africa, India, Ceylon, all these different areas, but they could have been obtained through trade, probably. So it's possible that we would have, and likely, obviously, Yahweh's not trying to set them up for failure there, so that we would have been able to get them in that way. So Moses, reading these ingredients, puts out what I've been calling the first crowdsourcing event, which basically is, hey, if anybody has this stuff, free will, goodwill offering, if you can donate. And so that's how the supplies for not just the oil, but for the building and the fabrics and everything else would have been collected the same way. It is known also that the work needed to be done by a perfumer. This is not something that you just throw together like, a soup or a stew. It has to be compounded in such a way to release the different fragrances at the right time. And these are things that I know nothing about, but I will say too, the reason the text is silent about the method is because it would have probably been assumed that a professional perfumer would have looked at that and been able to identify what to do without needing to be told. So we're not told, do you boil it? Do you macerate it? Do you grind it? What we do know, the spices themselves, we do know the type of ingredient that they were. So this is cinnamon, and it's the only one I have a visual aid for. But cinnamon and cassia are similarly smelling spices, and they both are the bark of a small tree. So if you can imagine peeling the bark off a tree, over time as it dries, it'll curl in on itself, which is what cinnamon does if you've seen that cinnamon stick. So they would have been similar in scent, but if you notice, the cinnamon is required less because it's more expensive. Cassia is sometimes referred to as bastard cinnamon because it's cheaper, but similar in scent. So the myrrh is one that we've all heard of. That's mentioned a lot in Old and New Testament. And in this case, it would have been the liquid, which would have been even more pungent. So that's preferred over the ground myrrh. And then the final one is the fragrant cane. Cane is kind of a nondescript grassy kind of little baby flower plant, but the attraction there would have been the rhizomes, which are the kind of the parts that live underground, and those could have been ground up. So these are expensive, difficult to cultivate, certainly need to be careful in how they are compounded. And, I think it's great that we have something with that specific instruction. And it was meant to be, as I said, holy and set apart, not to be used for Aaron or any other purpose outside of the priesthood and any of the utensils and furniture and any part of the tabernacle. So that was its exclusive use. We think that Bezalel or Oholiab, those are the two men who are mentioned specifically as being skilled in lots of different crafts. We think that probably they must have had some sort of training. Egypt would have been at this time known for its perfume, specifically perfume made of myrrh. So, practically speaking, you would have to figure this out somehow. And that seems the most likely place that they would have obviously learned the skill. With that, I think it's just interesting to note that Yahweh, wanted not only to have a visually beautiful tabernacle with lots of bright colors. The robes of the priests would have been brightly colored. You've got the tinkling of the bells. You've got all these other things, which if you're in the middle of a desert, you don't have a lot else to see or hear or smell. So I imagine that was even more striking because of the juxtaposition between those. And what's interesting is that he even wanted, his attendants, his priests, his representatives, and his house, his tabernacle, to have a certain scent, which I think is just a beautiful way of remembering that God also made all of our senses. And so why wouldn't he include all of those in creating this experience? Interestingly, about the spices themselves, they are used mostly because of their cost in more special occasions, frequently in weddings. And there are some verses that specifically refer to, for example, in Song of Songs, a garden that belongs to a bride is said to contain spikenard, saffron, calamus, and cinnamon, and all the trees of frankincense, myrrh, and aloes. And in another verse, Yahweh is anointing a king on his wedding day. This is in the Psalms, with myrrh, aloe, and cassia. So those are just two of many examples of specific spices being used either for weddings or for even just the marriage bed itself. And we wonder why he would have bothered. It certainly isn't necessary. There are other anointings in the Bible, even ones that are for holy use, where the scent is not mentioned. But in this case, it is. And I wondered if it had some significance there. So if we start reading further ahead in Hosea, we all know Hosea is about the story of a faithful husband and his disloyal wife representing Yahweh and the nation of Israel. And in Hosea 2, Yahweh is actually reminiscing about kind of the early days of his time with his bride, Israel. And what he says is that he is wanting to woo her back to himself after her disloyalty. So he says, therefore, behold, I am going to persuade her, bring her into the wilderness and speak kindly to her. Then I will give her vineyards as a door of hope. I am skipping a bit. And she will respond there as in the days of her youth, as in the day when she went up from the land of Egypt. And it will come about on that day, declares the Lord, that you will call me husband. So by his own words, he's referring to this time now here, having just removed his people from Egypt, as the days of their youth. And then obviously in the early days, and then he's referring to himself as the husband. So in a way, we could consider Sinai to be their honeymoon. And in that way, I think it makes a lot of sense that he would use some fragrances to allure, to persuade, to speak kindly. And I think that especially given that they had just come out of Egypt, where there was lush vegetation, there was abundant food and spices that they miss, and they complained even about missing some of those things, but also pagan temples and lots of greater population, therefore a lot more activity for all of the senses. And then so on top of that, you've got Pharaoh, who himself was a spectacle, and he wanted to, be in parades and have processionals and have all of the grandeur of the Pharaoh and all that he represented. And so then all of a sudden they're in this wilderness, and that's the honeymoon destination. But I think it may be somewhat intentional that for just one more reason why Yahweh is brilliant is that he wanted their full attention. So to finish, I just want to celebrate, I think, how successful he was in achieving exactly what he aimed for, which was in Exodus 29:46. Yahweh says, he's doing these things so that they will know I am the Lord their God who brought them out of Egypt, so that I might dwell among them. I am the Lord their God. So we know for sure that he wants to dwell. And part of that is the holy anointing that we talked about last time, and establishing that place where they could safely dwell. But the second part of that is that he wants to be known. He wants to know that I am the Lord. And how does he communicate that? There's lots of ways, but one of them is by these sensory experiences. And the scent of that oil is a way of communicating to a people that doesn't, they're not reading their Bibles in their tents at night. So how do we receive message or communication from Yahweh? Well, certainly, why wouldn't you use scent for that? So that is a beautiful thing. And at the end, when he's finished giving the recipe to Moses, he says, you shall speak to the sons of Israel, saying, this shall be a holy anointing oil to me throughout your generations. And so it's clear that he wants to establish these family traditions, so to speak, that will go just beyond that generation in the wilderness.